Hi there, everybody. Rabbi Leah here. Happy Tuesday morning. And I hope you're all well. Hope you had a great weekend. And it's good to be back with you again. So, when last we left our discussion of the various movements within Judaism, we had completed looking at the Orthodox movement, um, which we could spend many weeks on that in and of itself. But uh, to call orthodoxy a movement is a bit of a misnomer because, as I mentioned, if you were to ask somebody who was a practicing Orthodox Jew what they would simply say they were Jewish, believing that Orthodoxy is the authentic and right practice. So it is it's interesting when we look at the different streams of Judaism that we continue to call Orthodoxy one of the movements, and yet it isn't considered a movement at all by Orthodox Jews. So we know that the Hasidic movement, which was also known as the Freilichen, the joyous ones became the Haredi, the pious ones, and we have varying levels of practice even amongst Orthodox Jews. Certainly at one end of the continuum, what might be considered the Satmar, um, Haredi, who are Haredim, who are living very much like the Jews of the shtetls back a couple of hundred years, 200, 300 years, to those who are more modern Orthodox, who include women in teaching and in not in the minyan. The minyan is still considered only 10 men over the age of 13, but who may have a more open and egalitarian sense to women's role in worship and that sort of thing. So there are varying degrees, even amongst Orthodox practice, from extremely halachically bound to halacha, bound to the laws of Talmud, all the way to those who consider themselves to be modern Orthodox, who live in the quote real world, who have real jobs and real communities, and embrace modernity, even while being Shomer Shabbos and keeping some of the other rituals and practices of Orthodox Judaism. So a lot of people have had a question about what is Chabad? Where do they kind of fit into this spectrum of Jewish movements, Jewish practices, and so on? Chabad, which is the proper name is actually Chabad Lubavitch, is a major movement within um, mainstream Judaism, I guess one would call it. Their roots are in the Hasidic movement of the 18th century in Tsarist and communist Russia. And the leaders for Chabad, the original leaders for Chabad, struggled for the survival of Torah Judaism, of Torah true Judaism. So there are well over 3,000, probably closer to 4,000 Chabad institutions all over the world, 65 different countries, new centers opening on the average of one every 10 days. They are in South Africa, South America, Russia, Australia, Asia, the UK, and many parts of the United States. And a Chabad house is usually what is referred to as the center of study, the center of worship. But, you know, it is an Orthodox Jewish Hasidic movement. They are very well known for their outreach to the Jewish community, and they are um, great at marketing their brand of Judaism. So we'll kind of leave it at that. The founder was Shner Zalman of Liadi, founded in 1775. So again, we're looking at the end of the 18th century when there was a tremendous amount of influence from the Enlightenment movement. And kind of a backlash perhaps against what were the beginning stirrings of looking at religion through a different lens, and Chabad wanting to maintain the movement as a Torah true movement, um, adhering to Torah as the unequivocal, absolute Word of God. The founder was the rabbi is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, very interesting character, who has been gone for many years, but whose supporters still consider him to be their Rebbe. He actually died almost 20 years ago. Excuse me, almost 30 years ago. He died 26 years ago at the age of 92. And he is buried in Queens in New York, but he is still considered the Rebbe of the movement. And we talked last week about how important these Rebbes are in the Orthodox movement, how their teachings, their impact remains for generations and generations. And these families, also known as dynasties, can last for generations as well, always following what the Rebbe said. And you will hear Chabadniks constantly talking about the Rebbe, and they are not talking about the rabbi of the Chabad house that they go to, but they're talking about Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who, although gone for close to 30 years now, is still seen as the Rebbe of the movement. So that's kind of where Chabad fits into this spectrum of orthodoxy. Okay, so we're going to talk about Reform Judaism right now, and then come back to Conservative Judaism, because I think you have to understand Reform Judaism in order to understand the rise of Conservative Judaism. So Reform Judaism was the movement spearheaded by by German Jews in the middle of the 19th century. And this was a backlash against Orthodoxy and a response to the Enlightenment, which put a different spin on religious practices, not just Jewish religious practice, but a lot of religions began to look at their own orthodoxies and whether or not those continue to resonate and pertain to them in a post-Enlightenment age, when science was taking a premier role, and reason was taking a stronger role. And so there was this backlash against orthodoxy among those of a more modern era, who wanted to be able to continue to practice their religion, but in a way that would not separate them from the community as a whole, meaning the places in which they lived. And the particular forms which the denominations took have been shaped in many ways by immigration. Ashkenazi Jewish communities once concentrated in Eastern and Central Europe, to Western countries, and particularly in North America. And in the middle of the 20th century, North American Jewry then began to separate between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, but still reflecting a lot of the immigrant traditions of the countries of origin from where these individuals came. Reform Jews, as I mentioned at that time, were predominantly of German or Western European origin, and conservative and Orthodox were primarily from Eastern European countries. So we see patterns of migration also having quite a bit to do with the movement that one might have affiliated themselves with. Okay, so Reform Judaism comes along as a backlash to, or a response to, the restrictions of orthodoxy for a new generation, a generation that wanted to become more acculturated with whatever culture they were living in. They wanted to assimilate more. They were moving, in the United States, moving out of, later on, moving out of cities and into suburban areas, particularly post-World War II, but even earlier than that. So nowadays, approximately 35% of American Jews identify as Reform. But they identify as Reform, many of them, as a default, because they say, well, I can't be Orthodox because I'm not Shomer Shabbos, I don't keep kosher, I don't go to the mikveh, I don't pray 3 times a day, I don't wear a yarmulke, so I can't be Orthodox. I don't think I'm conservative because I don't, keep Shabbat to a certain degree. I'll drive on the Sabbath. I don't wear tefillin. I don't wear a yarmulke. So I don't keep kosher. So I can't be conservative. So what am I by default? I'm Reform, or I'm secular, but I'm Reform. I think for many, 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 many years, Reform Judaism got a very bad rap. And I think it's because members of other denominations did not understand what Reform Judaism was. I also think it's because many Reform Jews didn't understand what Reform Judaism was, and again saw it as a default. If I'm not conservative and I'm not Orthodox, then, logic tells me I must be this other thing. The Reform movement, emphasizes Jewish ethical tradition over obligations of Jewish law. But I want to give a caveat to that, because even though Reform Judaism may not consider itself to be a halachically bound movement, halakha still does play a role. It does. Jewish law still plays a role. So traditionally, Reform Judaism has sought to try to adapt Jewish tradition to modern sensibilities and sees itself as politically progressive, social justice oriented, while still offering and emphasizing personal choice in matters of ritual observance. And within Reform Judaism, there are some major institutions: the Union for Reform Judaism, which is kind of the overarching organization to which many Reform congregations belong; the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reform seminary with 4 campuses, 1 in Israel and 3 in the United States, in Cincinnati, New York, and Los Angeles; The Religious Action Center, which is the social justice arm of the Reformed Jewish Music movement, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is, for lack of a better term, the the union, but not really a union in the sense of other kinds of unions, but the organization to which Reform rabbis can belong, which sets up ethical guidelines for rabbis, continuing education, as well as placement of Reform rabbis in congregations and other institutions. So, um, but it's so much more than that. Reform Judaism began in earnest in 1885 with their first meeting in Pittsburgh, where they uh, came out with a declaration of principles. So it wasn't a platform yet, it was a declaration of principles. And if you read just a portion of it, it gives you great insight into what the early reformers were thinking. So I'm going to read a little bit of that now, and then I'm going to read an article of the Statement of Principles for Reform Judaism from the last time that this was done, which was in 1999. So it's over 20 years already, and I think it's time for a new statement of principles from the Union for Reform Judaism. But in the 1885 Pittsburgh Conference, convened at the call of Kaufman Kohler, who was a Reform rabbi in New York, and notice the name, very German. He was an immigrant from Germany. It was held from November 16th through November 19th, 1885, with Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise presiding. Now, a lot of these rabbis of German origin came to the United States when things were bad in Europe, which happened frequently over many years. And the meeting, this particular meeting, was declared the continuation of the Philadelphia Conference in 1869, which was the continuation of the German Conference of 1841 to 1846. So the rabbis adopted a an 8-point text that covered everything from religious practice to what their belief was in how they looked at the Torah and so on. So they said the following: "We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite, and in every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man." So, a recognition that within each of us there dwells a spark of the divine. "We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea." God idea. Interesting. "As taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized by the Jewish teachers in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended amidst continual struggles and trials and under enforced isolation this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race." Okay, so I guess that first paragraph would indicate that Reform Judaism has some sort of idea about the existence of God. And what that God idea is something that we struggle with still, and that that is a key and integral component of what Reform Jews do, is that we struggle with this God idea, trying to create for ourselves meaning. So now that we know what Reform Judaism, how they responded to this God idea, next we have to look at what Reform Judaism believes about the Bible. And they said in 1885, we recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God. In other words, the light unto the nations, that we were to serve as moral exemplars to the rest of the world. And we value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific research in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism. The Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice, dealing with men in miraculous narratives. Okay, so recognizing the Bible, but as a record of an ancient tradition. They then go on to say that we recognize in the Mosaic legislation, Mosaic meaning based on Moses's legislation, a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So this is the beginning of the early reform movement of throwing out the baby, the bathwater, and the bathtub. This is not the Reform Judaism of today. And that has to be made clear. Because it does say in this Pittsburgh Conference platform or Declaration of Principles, we recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. We are convinced of the utmost necessity of preserving the historical identity with our great past. Christianity and Islam being daughter religions of Judaism. Notice daughter religions and not sister religions. So a sister religion implies a sibling that would be kind of on the same plane if you were to look at a genealogy, right? Your siblings are on the same plane. However, a daughter religion is going to be under you. So they say that that Christianity and Islam being daughter religions, excuse me, of Judaism, we appreciate their providential mission to aid in the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. So on the one hand, we are appreciative of the moral tradition of these other religions. On the other hand, we recognize them as not our siblings, but our children. They also say that we hold all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws. So any laws that were that came out of the Torah, part of Moses's tradition, and rabbinical laws. And what are the rabbinical laws? The laws of Mishnah and Talmud, Mishnah and Gemara, as regulate, here we go, diet, priestly purity, and dress, that these originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. Okay, Let me read that last sentence again. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. So if we're a priestly people, a light unto the nations, and the observance of these these ideas from rabbinical laws are going to obstruct rather than further modern spiritual elevation, we shouldn't be doing them. And they name these areas specifically: diet, priestly purity, and dress. A not so subtle way of saying kashrut doesn't make us holier. Priestly purity, the mikvah, going to the mikvah, doesn't make us holier. And dress, meaning kippah, talit, tefillin, dressing sniut, meaning dressing modestly, doesn't make us better Jews, doesn't elevate us spiritually, and has no bearing on what it really means to be Jewish. So I think that paragraph alone is pretty radical. And these reformers of the late 19th century were not mincing words. And this is why one of the first ordination classes of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, or at that time it was just the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which was founded in 1885 by Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise, had, after their ordination, a banquet luncheon. And at that banquet luncheon, which was called the Treifa banquet, the menu included shrimp and pork, because no longer was kashrut seen as a way for one to elevate themselves Jewishly. Now, I would submit to you that most civil movements, whether it was the women's movement, the Black Power movement, the gay pride movement, usually have the pendulum swing to a pretty radical place initially. And that is to be noticed and to show that we are a force to be reckoned with. But that pendulum doesn't necessarily stay there forever. Once that movement is more comfortable in its own skin, so to speak, or in its own practice, the pendulum tends to move a little bit more towards center, sometimes even to right of center, before it settles somewhere in the middle more comfortably. Which is why, if you walk into a Reform synagogue today, you're going to see lots of kippahs, lots of taluses, and even lots of tefillin at a morning service. And we'll talk more about that practice and how the pendulum came to swing a little more to the less radical, let's throw it all outside of the continuum, to a more middle of the road practice, so to speak. Reform, as I mentioned last week, is considered a verb, not just an adjective. So Reform Judaism, and as a proud Reform Jew who's more conservative in her practice, I can say that I believe Reform Judaism is perhaps the most authentic type of Judaism. Because if it weren't for the rabbis of Rabbinic Judaism in the year 70 of the Common Era, recognizing that the temple was now destroyed, we better reform, we better move, modernize, change, we wouldn't be here today having this discussion. I would love to get your feedback on this. We're going to talk more on Thursday about Reform Judaism. We're going to take a look at the Statement of Principles from 1999 to see what 100 plus years did to the movement. And then we're going to continue with conservative Judaism and some of the 20th century post-denominational movements. So I hope this has given you lots of food for thought. Um, and if you have any questions or comments, I welcome you to email those to me or to call me and ask. And I will see you again on Thursday morning for more Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Until then, lehitraot. Bye bye.